just think about the political impact of this, because we're looking at tax rises for people on high earnings. There are measures there from child poverty, and he's made some gestures in that direction. But overall, do you think Mr. Darling came to the House today thinking, on the whole, the reaction to this is going to be a bit of shock horror?
Well, he knew that it would be gruesome. He knew that it would be dominated, and I think that's why ministers have tried to get the message out about how bad it was in advance, so that really that today's headline writers for tomorrow's papers maybe think, well, we're a bit bored saying it's the worst recession and the borrowing's good. Why don't we go for that top-rate tax story? That'll interest our readers. And in a sense, that is one reason I think he's gone for it. As Stephanie says, it doesn't raise a lot of money. The Institute of Fiscal Studies recently doubted that the 45p top tax rate he'd announced would raise any money at all. But what it will do is energise a debate. Labour have broken their manifesto promise. Is it a good or a bad thing? Will the Tories reverse it? Is it a good or a bad thing? Let's just be honest with ourselves. What politicians know is the media's got more than its fair share of top taxpayers in it, particularly editors of newspapers, and they tend to obsess about those issues and not, frankly, pay a lot of attention to things like tax credits, which many of our viewers watching will care very passionately about. And therefore, that dread word spin, there's a little element here of just try and change the news agenda.
How strong was the response from David Cameron?
Oh, I think he feels very comfortable, doesn't he? He feels very confident. But you see in the approach the difference. What he wants to do is say, let's talk about this day of reckoning, as the Tories called it. Let's look at the whole performance of the government on the economy. What the Chancellor is desperate to do is to say, no, well, OK, that's happened. That was about the world economy. Let's talk about the choices that governments need to make over the next few years. And that's how politics will now shape up. One little amusing thing for you, Hugh. If the Chancellor's optimism is right, if growth resumes at the turn of the year, when will the statistic come out confirming that?
I wonder.
8 days, by my calculation, before something called the general election.
Well, what an interesting thought, Nick. And there you go, old cynic that you are. Thank you very much. Robert, you're not a cynic. You've been looking at these figures. Now, can we talk about the credibility of some of these figures first, and whether you think that, the city is going to buy some of these forecasts?
Well, the big number that stood out for me when I got to the back of this mighty tome, spelling out the financial difficulties we face, was a number of £220 billion for the amount of government bonds or gilts that the government has to sell this year. Now, that is the money that it actually has to borrow from investors globally. It is massively more than they were expecting to have to borrow only a few weeks ago. It was about 150 billion then. OK, so it's up by about 70 billion pounds. It's an all-time record. Never in the history of this government has that they attempted to sell anything like as much of that as that. And so investors there'll be a bit of a gulp from investors because it is by no means a slam dunk that they will be able to borrow all that amount of money. And now we've just heard from Stephanie about the growth forecasts, which are more optimistic than most forecasters, outside forecasters are saying. So people will be concerned that the reality will be even worse than this, that the government will end up having to borrow even worse than this. And I suppose at the back of the Chancellor's mind, the thing that will be really worrying him is whether or not our AAA credit rating, it is the market's assessment, credit rating agency's assessment that we are a completely cast iron, solid gold borrower, whether that will come under pressure. Because if we were to lose that credit rating, the cost of all this borrowing would go up even more. If I could just make one other very quick point. For those of us of a certain age, actually this all feels fantastically familiar. In a way, this seems to me to be taking us back, I think Nick implied this, to the politics of the 1970s. When I was covering politics directly in the mid-1990s, the city was very mistrustful of Labour. They said Labour was the party of soaking the rich and of incompetence when it came to public finances. And I think there will be many people in the city who thought who were persuaded by Tony Blair that was wrong, who will now be saying, we told you so. And the Tories will be in an interesting dilemma about whether or not to go along with that analysis, that rather old-fashioned city analysis of Labour.
Note this very briefly, Hugh. The opinion polls show, though, that where before, when Tony Blair promised not to put top-rate tax up, That was a popular promise because people were aspirational, they were nervy. Now people are in favour of a higher top rate of tax. In part, possibly they don't think they're ever going to earn that sort of money, but partly, of course, because they blame the credit crunch, the crisis, on the rich. And therefore, the politics has changed. It's not just that the government's, as it were, stood on its head. The opinion polls have changed too.
OK, let's see how that squares. Stephanie, I'll be back with you in a second. We want to see how that squares with what's going on in the city and how they're reacting there, because Naga Munchetti's there for us. Naga, what are they saying?
There's an element of surprise that's rumbling around this trading floor here in the city, Hugh, and that's all down to this debt announcement. The government is issuing more debt, much more debt than expected. Some of the reports said more than £200 billion worth of debt to be issued in the coming year, and we've had that figure, and that's come through at least £220 billion. Well, I've got